The Silent Watchers. The room fell silent as General Corvo of the Zin Consortium stared at the holographic display. Every other race in the intergalactic coalition had already thrown everything they had into the war effort, exhausting their resources in the long and bloody struggle against the Kidari. Yet somewhere in the background, humans had lingered. They had sent aid, sure, and provided logistic support, but direct military action? Not a single human ship had entered the fray. Until now. Yes, General, replied Admiral Merrick of the Ralchok Union, his scaled face betraying no emotion. Humanity officially declared its intent to engage in combat operations as of 10 minutes ago. Corvo rubbed his temples in disbelief. He had heard rumors of human capabilities but dismissed them as exaggerated death world or bravado. Now, facing the cold reality of the situation, he felt a strange mixture of anxiety and curiosity. Why now? And more importantly, what are the humans planning to do in a conflict that has dragged on for years? Show me their initial movements, Corvo ordered, his voice a touch sharper than intended. The holographic map of the galaxy zoomed in on the contested sectors. The Kidari fleet had established formidable defensive lines in key star systems, daring anyone to challenge them. Humanity's forces had materialized at the edge of the battlefield, a mere blip against the vast armadas of their enemies. As the human signature warships emerged on the display, whispers circulated among the assembled coalition commanders. Human ships were sleek and compact, lacking the imposing size and gaudy weapon arrays of other species. They seemed, at first glance, grossly underprepared. That's it, someone muttered skeptically. Corvo narrowed his eyes at the display, watching as the human vessels formed a tight formation. There was no grand show of force, no drawn-out posturing. In fact, to the untrained eye, it appeared almost absurdly minimal: a lone command ship, a scattering of destroyers, and a squadron of escort frigates. The humans had committed what looked like a fraction of their fleet. The room filled with an unsettling quiet as everyone processed what they were seeing. The Kidari responded almost immediately, shifting their forces to meet the new threat. The enemy had no reason to take the human force seriously. After all, no one else had managed to break their lines in years. Then it began. Corvo blinked, hardly believing his eyes. The human ships moved with a precision that bordered on artistry, cutting through space with alarming speed. Within seconds, the coalition network of communication channels buzzed with reports of electromagnetic pulses and sensor jamming. For the Kidari, it was like being blindfolded in the middle of a storm. What are they doing? Admiral Merrick's usually composed demeanor cracked, his voice betraying a hint of awe. Electronic warfare, Corvo replied, his tone uncertain. But this is on a scale I've never seen before. The Kidari fleets floundered as their targeting systems and defensive measures became little more than dead weight. Human ships darted in and out of formation with a grace that seemed almost casual, launching volleys of high-velocity projectiles. It wasn't the brute force assaults the coalition had grown used to seeing. This was something else, warfare reduced to a deadly ballet. Sir, the Kidari's outer defenses are collapsing, a comms officer reported, eyes wide as he stared at the data streams flooding in. Corvo leaned forward in his seat, focusing intently on the display. This was the moment: would the humans press their advantage or fall back? His doubts were immediately answered when the human fleet accelerated, exploiting the chaos they had created. Their tactics shifted fluidly, seemingly predicting every Kidari attempt at countermeasures. How are they? Merrick began, trailing off as he watched another sector fall to the human advance. It's as if they knew exactly where to strike. Corvo couldn't help but marvel at the spectacle. The humans moved with an efficiency that was almost inhuman, and their strategy defied conventional military logic. Most species threw waves of ships at their enemies, relying on overwhelming force to break through defenses. Humans, on the other hand, used precision strikes, disabling critical systems and leaving the Kidari fleet to flounder like a beast stripped of its senses. What kind of weaponry are they using? one of the coalition officers blurted out, his tone a mix of horror and fascination. Their weapons seem conventional, a tactical analyst stammered, but they're using them in ways we never considered. As the minutes ticked by, the coalition command room descended into a stunned silence. A full hour had passed since humanity's first engagement, and the Qadari's mighty armadas were reduced to a fragmented, retreating mess. Even the coalition's most optimistic projections hadn't accounted for this level of effectiveness. Corvo watched as the holographic map updated, showing entire Qadari strongholds going dark one after another. This wasn't just a victory, it was a dissection. The humans weren't merely overpowering the enemy, they were tearing apart the Qadari's entire battle doctrine. Sector Gamma has fallen, the comms officer announced, breaking the silence, and reports indicate no human losses. Impossible, Merrick hissed, his scaled features twisting in disbelief. How can they sustain 0 casualties? Corvo swallowed hard, his eyes locked onto the tactical feed. The human fleet continued its relentless advance, their ships weaving through debris fields and evading incoming fire with an ease that seemed almost playful. As another Qadari command ship was reduced to a ball of flame, it became evident that this was no fluke. The humans were not just skilled, they were on a completely different level. I don't understand, Corvo admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. What have they been doing all this time if not fighting? Preparing, a new voice cut in, cold and analytical. All heads turned to see a human officer standing at the doorway, clad in a crisp uniform devoid of ornamentation. His eyes, sharp and unreadable, scanned the room as if assessing each individual's worth. You call this a war, he continued, striding forward to the center of the room, but to us, it's an exercise. A test of tactical adaptability. The coalition officers exchanged uncertain glances. The human's tone was neither boastful nor arrogant, it was matter-of-fact. Corvo clenched his jaw, unsure whether to feel anger or grudging admiration. What's your objective? He demanded, struggling to keep his voice steady. Why now? The human officer tilted his head slightly, as if considering how to best explain something painfully obvious. Our objective, he began, is to end this conflict in the most efficient manner possible. And as for why now, we waited until you were ready to accept our methods. Corvo felt a shiver run down his spine. The words were simple, almost benign, yet they carried a weight that suggested something far beyond what any of them had anticipated. Ready? You think we were ready for this? Merrick scoffed, shaking his head. The human's gaze turned to the holographic map, where the last remnants of the Qadari forces were being systematically dismantled. If you weren't, he replied calmly, this war would have ended much sooner. Corvo stared at the map, struggling to process the unfolding events. The humans were pushing toward the heart of Qadari territory, their advance so rapid it defied explanation. And yet, as he watched, a thought began to form, a question that he wasn't sure he wanted the answer to. Just what kind of war had humanity been preparing for all this time? The room remained silent as the implications of that question sank in. The coalition commanders watched the holographic display with a mix of awe and trepidation, knowing that they were witnessing not just the end of a war, but perhaps the beginning of something far more significant. The human officer stood quietly, his presence a reminder that everything they thought they knew about warfare had just been upended. Humanity hadn't just entered the war, they had redefined it. And as Corvo watched the systematic dismantling of the Qadari fleet, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the opening move in a much larger game. A game that humanity had been practicing for far longer than anyone had realized. The art of war. Corvo's eyes stayed fixed on the holographic display as the humans pressed deeper into Qadari territory. The coalition commanders around him remained silent, transfixed by the near absurdity unfolding before them. The human fleet wasn't just fighting, it was dissecting its opponents, exploiting every weakness with a precision that bordered on supernatural. Report, barked Admiral Merrick, breaking the silence. What's the status of the Qadari Central Command? The tactical officer's eyes darted between screens, hands trembling as he processed the incoming data. Central Command it's failing, sir. The humans have neutralized their shield arrays, and they're launching boarding pods as we speak. Corvo felt his jaw clench involuntarily. The Kidari Central Command was a fortress, protected by layers of defenses that had held against every coalition assault for years. Now those defenses were failing one by one, like brittle glass under a relentless hammer. Boarding pods? Merrick echoed, his tone a mixture of disbelief and horror. They're going inside. The human officer standing nearby merely nodded, his expression impassive. Yes, he said simply. We find that surgical strikes are more effective than brute force. Our objective is to seize control, not annihilate. Corvo glanced at the officer, unable to suppress a sense of dread. These humans, with their calm demeanor and deliberate actions, were nothing like the rabid warriors he had expected. They were methodical, calculating, and frighteningly detached from the chaos they were orchestrating. How are they managing this? Another coalition commander asked, his voice shaky. We've been fighting the Kidari for years and barely dented their defenses, and now this? Training, the human officer replied matter-of-factly. We've trained for scenarios like this long before we even encountered the Kidari. Space warfare, ground combat, electronic countermeasures, it's all part of the doctrine. Doctrine? Corvo repeated, narrowing his eyes. You make it sound like you expected this war. The human officer turned to face Corvo, his expression betraying nothing. Expected? No. Prepared for? Always. The response sent a chill through the room. The coalition had gone to war out of necessity, driven by a desperate need to defend their territories from the Kidari onslaught. But the humans, they had been preparing for war as if it were an inevitability. And now, as Corvo watched the human fleet systematically dismantle the Kidari defenses, he realized that this was not just a show of military might. It was a demonstration of control. General Corvo, a voice crackled through the command room speakers, interrupting his thoughts. It was one of the coalition's reconnaissance officers stationed near the Kidari border. The Kidari flagship is moving, it's trying to retreat to a more fortified sector. Let me guess, Merrick said, his tone laced with bitter sarcasm. The humans have already anticipated that. The human officer didn't so much as blink. Of course. They'll allow the flagship to retreat for now. It's an old tactic, push them to their last bastion where they feel safe, then remove even that sense of security. Corvo couldn't believe what he was hearing. You're toying with them? He asked, incredulous. Not toying, the human officer corrected, his voice devoid of emotion. We're ensuring that when they fall completely. No room for recovery, no chance to regroup. This war has dragged on because everyone fought piecemeal. We don't. Corvo turned back to the map, watching as the Kidari fleet scrambled to reposition. Panic had clearly set in. The humans had broken the unspoken rules of this conflict, operating on a level that the Kidari had never encountered before. We're getting reports of ground operations, the tactical officer announced, eyes wide with shock. The humans have deployed their soldiers to key Kidari planets. Merrick let out a low hiss. How are they already launching ground assaults? We've barely established space superiority. The human officer crossed his arms, eyes glued to the map. Parallel operations. While space forces disrupt and dismantle enemy fleets, ground units secure key installations. We train for this, to overwhelm on multiple fronts simultaneously. Corvo felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Every coalition force had focused on one front at a time, struggling to balance the demands of space and ground combat. But the humans, they seemed to have mastered both, executing their plan with a level of coordination that bordered on inhuman. Ground reports coming in, the comms officer said, his voice barely above a whisper. The humans have neutralized the Kidari planetary defenses. No significant resistance. Corvo nearly choked on his disbelief. The Kidari planets were fortresses, shielded and armed to the teeth. Coalition forces had tried for months, if not years, to breach them with little to show for their efforts. Yet here were the humans, taking those planets in mere moments. What kind of soldiers are they? Someone muttered, voicing the question that lingered in every mind. Our soldiers are adaptable, the human officer replied, his tone suggesting that the answer was self-evident. We train them not just to fight, but to think, to analyze, adapt, and exploit weaknesses in real time. A hush settled over the room as the coalition officers absorbed this. The humans had turned war into a science, one where victory was less about raw power and more about precision. It was terrifying. What's their next move? Corvo found himself asking, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. The flagship, the human officer replied without hesitation. They'll let it retreat, and then they'll cut off every route back to safety. Once isolated, the Kidari command will have no choice but to surrender or be wiped out. So that's it? Merrick questioned, eyes wide. They're already anticipating the endgame. Anticipating? The human officer smirked, a flicker of something almost resembling amusement crossing his face for the first time. No. They're enacting it. This war was over the moment we entered. The coalition commanders exchanged uneasy glances. It wasn't just the humans' tactics or technology that unsettled them, it was their attitude. They approached war as if it were an equation to be solved, each variable accounted for, each outcome calculated. The room fell silent again as the humans continued their advance. More Kidari worlds went dark on the map, one after another, like stars winking out in a vast night sky. The holographic display now showed the Kidari flagship retreating toward its last stronghold, pursued not by a swarm of human ships, but by a calculated, relentless force. What happens if the Kidari surrender? Corvo asked, almost dreading the answer. The human officer's eyes narrowed. Then they live, he said simply. We don't fight to exterminate. We fight to win, and to make sure no one ever thinks of challenging us again. Corvo nodded, swallowing hard. There was a cold logic to it, a ruthlessness that defied everything he had ever known about warfare. The humans had entered the battlefield not just to win, but to redefine what winning meant. As the map continued to shift, the Kidari's last bastion on the brink of collapse, Corvo couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much larger. And he had no idea what that something was. In just a few short hours, humanity had not only changed the course of the war, they had changed the very nature of warfare itself. The galaxy would never be the same, and as Corvo watched the systematic dismantling of the once mighty Kidari Empire, he wondered if anyone truly understood what that meant. The human officer stood silently, watching the destruction unfold with the same detached interest one might show while observing a training exercise. And perhaps that's exactly what this was to them, just another drill, another scenario they had prepared for countless times before. The thought sent a chill down Corvo's spine. If this was merely practice, what would it look like when humanity truly went to war? The breaking point. The room was cloaked in a tense silence as the holographic display revealed the final stages of the human offensive. The Kidari flagship, once a symbol of indomitable power, now appeared small and insignificant as it limped toward its last fortified sector. Its hull was scarred from earlier engagements, thrusters flickering erratically, and its once mighty escorts were little more than debris scattered across space. Corvo glanced around the command center, where coalition officers sat in stunned disbelief. Some wore expressions of awe, others fear, but none could hide their fascination with the humans' unfolding strategy. A mere 5 hours ago, the Kidari had been considered unbeatable. Now their defeat seemed not only possible but inevitable. Human fleet is closing in on the flagship's fallback point, reported the tactical officer, his voice shaky as if he himself couldn't quite grasp what was happening. They've surrounded the sector, blocking every escape route. Any signs of Kidari reinforcements? Corvo asked, though he suspected the answer. None, sir. The humans, they've already crippled their supply lines and reserve forces, the officer replied, shaking his head in disbelief. It's over. They have nowhere left to run. Corvo watched as the human ships formed a precise circle around the flagship's final refuge. They made no grand gestures, issued no ultimatums, they merely waited, their formation a silent declaration of dominance. It was a statement as clear as if it had been spoken aloud: there is no escape. The human officer, still standing calmly among the coalition commanders, tilted his head slightly. We've transmitted terms of surrender, he announced. The Kidari have 5 minutes to comply. Otherwise, we proceed with final neutralization. Merrick let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on the display. And if they don't surrender, he challenged, unable to mask his disdain, you just wipe them out. The human officer's gaze remained impassive. If they choose to reject the terms, then yes, he replied evenly. But understand, our goal is not destruction. It's resolution. The end of a conflict so decisively that it cannot resume. Corvo felt a knot in his stomach. The humans operated on an entirely different wavelength, where war was not about glory or honor but about efficiency and finality. They didn't leave room for ambiguity. In their hands, war was a tool to enforce peace, to sculpt the galaxy into a shape where resistance was simply impractical. The Kidari flagship is responding, the comms officer cut in, tension lacing his voice. They're requesting terms. A murmur ran through the coalition command room. Could it be? After years of war, was it really coming to an end? Put it on, Corvo ordered, trying to maintain an air of authority despite the surreal situation. The holographic display shifted to show the bridge of the Kidari flagship. The Kidari commander appeared on screen, eyes burning with a mixture of rage and fear. His uniform was disheveled, his once imposing demeanor reduced to a semblance of controlled panic. We acknowledge your terms, human, the commander spat, his voice trembling. But know this, you have only won through trickery and deceit, not strength. The human officer stepped forward, his expression unchanged. You lost because you relied on old doctrines, outdated by eons, he said calmly. Strength lies not in brute force but in adaptability, in understanding every facet of conflict. We offered you a chance to end this peacefully long before today. You chose otherwise. The Kidari commander glared, his defiance hanging by a thread. For a moment, it seemed he might lash out, reject the terms out of sheer spite. But then he glanced around his own bridge, at the faces of his officers, and the weight of reality settled in. The humans had cornered them, stripped them of every advantage, and now held the galaxy's attention on this final moment. Very well, the commander muttered, bowing his head. We surrender. A wave of shock rippled through the coalition command room. It was over. Just like that. Years of grueling conflict, countless lives lost, and endless resources expended had culminated in a surrender within 5 hours of humanity entering the fray. The sheer finality of it left Corvo momentarily speechless. Transmission confirmed, the comms officer announced, barely containing his own surprise. The Kidari have ordered all remaining forces to stand down. The human officer nodded, turning to the coalition commanders. The war is now officially concluded, he stated simply. Our ships will begin the stabilization process for Kidari systems, and coalition forces are free to withdraw to their respective territories. Corvo opened his mouth to speak, but words failed him. It felt surreal. The Kidari were defeated, not in a drawn-out campaign, but in a surgical strike that lasted mere hours. Humanity had achieved in one engagement what the rest of the galaxy had failed to accomplish over years. But more than that, they had reshaped the entire concept of war. How? Corvo finally managed, his voice barely a whisper. How did you prepare for something like this? To end a war so swiftly? The human officer regarded him with an inscrutable gaze. "We come from a world where conflict is an inherent part of existence," he explained. "Survival demanded we learn to adapt, to innovate, and to end threats with finality. War is not our goal, it's a means to an end. A peace that others will think twice about disturbing." Corvo nodded, absorbing the words. It wasn't just about power, it was about understanding, about preparing for every eventuality. Humanity had honed their methods, trained their minds, and embraced a brutal efficiency that set them apart. They hadn't merely joined the war, they had transcended it, revealing that victory was not a matter of who fought the longest but who fought the smartest. As the coalition officers dispersed, Corvo watched the human fleet regroup on the holographic map. They moved with the same quiet precision as they had during the battle, now shifting to their post-war objectives: stabilization, reconstruction. They were not conquerors basking in glory, they were pragmatists already setting the groundwork for what came next. For the first time in years, Corvo felt a strange sense of hope mingled with an edge of fear. Humanity had shown what they were capable of, and the galaxy would never be the same. They had rewritten the rules of war, and in doing so had forged a path toward a peace that could last. But as he watched the methodical movements of the human ships, another thought crept into his mind. If this was how humanity handled a regional conflict, what would they do if faced with a true threat to their existence? The question lingered, unanswered, as the last echoes of battle faded into the void. The war had ended not with a grand finale but with a realization that humanity, in its calculated brilliance, had always known exactly when and how to win. And perhaps that was the most terrifying revelation of all. The human element. Humans do what for fun? Commander Kell's translator device buzzed and clicked, trying to make sense of the bewildering scene in front of him. Around the training field, rows of human cadets marched through mud, rain pelting their faces, with shouts of encouragement and insults flying from instructors clad in dark green uniforms. To Kell's eyes, it looked more like an exercise in madness than military discipline. His blue-skinned aide, Lieutenant Varric, adjusted his gaze, equally perplexed. "Sir," Varric stammered, glancing nervously at the humans. "Our report said this was one of their premier military academies. Perhaps this is normal." Kell crossed his arms. "Normal? Look at them. This isn't training, it's torture." The commander, who hailed from the Cossack fleet, a species known for its calm intellect and preference for advanced warfare tactics, had anticipated a tour full of strategic discussions, not a descent into a scene of primal chaos. He began to suspect that their notions of military training were worlds apart. A human officer approached, his uniform soaked but his face wearing a grin that seemed wholly inappropriate for the grim weather. "Commander Kell," he barked, offering a handshake that Kell cautiously accepted. "Welcome to West Point. I'm Major Harlow, your guide today." Kell nodded stiffly, trying to avoid staring at the strange glint in the human's eyes. "Major Harlow, could you explain what exactly these cadets are enduring?" The major laughed, a sound that echoed over the training grounds. "Just a little exercise called Field Week. Teaches them teamwork, resilience, and how to function when everything's going wrong." Harlow gestured toward a group of cadets crawling under a net, their uniforms streaked with mud. "See that? That's what we call the mud pit crawl. It builds character." "Builds character?" Kell repeated, turning to Varric, whose expression had grown increasingly alarmed. "You call forcing them through filth a character-building exercise?" "Not just any filth," Harlow said, raising a finger as if imparting wisdom. "That's all natural, high-quality mud. Best kind for training." Kell's mouth hung slightly open as he tried to process the statement. Varric quickly whispered, "Perhaps it's a metaphor, sir. They are speaking figuratively." "I wish it were that simple," Kell muttered, watching as a cadet slipped, face-planting directly into the mud. The human cadet merely got up, wiped his face, and continued the crawl without hesitation. It was as if they thrived in adversity. The Cossack trained their soldiers with simulations and controlled environments. Physical discomfort was seen as an unnecessary distraction. Here, the humans seemed to relish in it. "Come on," Harlow gestured, leading them further along the track. "This is just the beginning." The trio moved toward an obstacle course of nightmarish proportions. It was a tangle of rope climbs, towering walls, barbed wire, and something that Kel could only describe as a water-filled trench designed specifically to break wills. "What's this for?" Kel asked, dreading the answer. "Ah, this is the crucible," Harlow announced proudly. "Final test of their training. They go through it sleep-deprived and hungry. If they make it to the end, they've earned their place." Kel blinked, trying to grasp the full horror of it. "You deprive them of food and sleep intentionally?" "Absolutely," Harlow confirmed, showing no signs of discomfort. "It's a lesson in pushing through limits. We break them down here so the enemy can't do it later." The concept was alien to Kel, literally and figuratively. Cossack warriors were trained to maintain peak physical and mental conditions, given ample rest and nutrition to maximize efficiency. The idea of breaking one's own soldiers before they even saw combat was sheer lunacy to him. "If I may," Varric interjected cautiously, "what percentage of your cadets complete this crucible?" "Oh, about 95%, Harlow replied casually. "Some fall out, sure, but that's how you separate those who want to be soldiers from those who are meant to be soldiers." Kel felt his stomach churn. The Cossack fleet accepted only those who passed their stringent intellectual assessments, and even then, they didn't subject their candidates to anything this brutal. He turned his gaze to the cadets scrambling over a wooden wall, their faces grimacing in effort, yet eyes shining with an odd mixture of focus and, was that joy? Harlow led them onward, oblivious to Kel's discomfort. "Next, I'll show you the survival training. You're going to love this one." The alien commander doubted that very much. They arrived at a forested area where cadets were clustered around, each holding what appeared to be rudimentary tools. "What are they doing?" Kel asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "Making shelters," Harlow replied nonchalantly. "They have to spend the night out here with just a knife and some rope." Kel took a step back, appalled. "You send them into the wild with only a knife?" "That's right," Harlow said with a satisfied nod. "Teaches them to adapt. The environment is the best teacher there is." "Best teacher?" Kel echoed, struggling to understand. He imagined Cossack soldiers lost in a similar environment, they would rely on technology, not crude survival tactics. The Academy's philosophy was becoming increasingly clear and horrifying. Humans embraced adversity not as an obstacle to avoid but as a tool for forging strength. Harlow pointed to a cadet digging into the ground with his bare hands. "See that? He's making a fire pit. Can't survive without warmth." Kel glanced at Varric, who was scribbling notes furiously, his antenna twitching in a sign of deep stress. This wasn't what they had expected. They had heard humans were formidable warriors, but the reason why was now glaringly evident and deeply unsettling. These beings honed themselves in the most extreme conditions and wore their struggle as a badge of honor. "How do they endure this?" Kel asked, his voice barely masking his growing concern. Harlow grinned. "Simple, they embrace it. You see, Commander, humans don't just survive adversity. We thrive on it." The tour continued much to Commander Kel's growing discomfort. Major Harlow's enthusiasm only seemed to increase as they approached another section of the academy, a large open field ringed with high fences and lined with odd-looking contraptions. The faint echoes of explosions filled the air, sending a shiver down Kel's spine. "What exactly is this place?" Kel asked, bracing himself for yet another bizarre revelation. "This, Commander, is our live-fire training range," Harlow replied proudly. "It's where we test their accuracy, composure, and quick decision-making under pressure." Kel glanced around, noticing the expressions on the human cadets' faces. They showed no signs of fear, only a grim focus as they handled their weapons with precision. In the Cossack fleet, live-fire exercises were reserved for the elite, executed with controlled parameters to ensure maximum safety. Here, the humans seemed to throw caution to the wind. "Observe," Harlow said as he gestured toward a line of cadets. Each was equipped with a bulky device strapped to their backs, with tubes and wiring feeding into what looked like a projectile weapon. The cadets took their positions and at the sound of a whistle, they dashed forward, weaving between obstacles as they fired at moving targets. "Those are our tactical drills," Harlow explained. "The cadets have to hit all targets accurately while avoiding simulated enemy fire. Keeps them on their toes." Kel watched in horrified fascination. The cadets moved fluidly, their movements seemingly reckless yet somehow orchestrated. When one stumbled or missed a target, an instructor would immediately bark orders, forcing the cadet to repeat the exercise. There was no room for error. "They are harsh with their own kind," Varric whispered, his antenna twitching uncontrollably. "Failure seems to be met with no mercy." Kel nodded, his eyes fixed on the scene. "And yet they keep pushing forward," he muttered. "There is no hesitance, no second-guessing. They act as if the danger is part of the routine." A sudden boom erupted from nearby, accompanied by a plume of smoke. Kel instinctively ducked, covering his head with his arms while Varric scrambled to maintain his balance. The Cossack commander spun around, eyes wide with alarm. A group of cadets had gathered around a pit where they were deploying what appeared to be explosive devices. "Easy there, Commander," Harlow said, clearly amused. "Just a little grenade practice." "Grenades?" Kel straightened up, feeling his heart's race. "You give these younglings explosive devices to train with?" "Of course," Harlow replied. "If they don't learn how to handle them properly here, how can we expect them to use them effectively in the field?" The logic made a twisted sort of sense, but it was far beyond what Kel could accept. In Cossack military training, handling explosives was a task left to specialized units, taught through simulations in controlled environments. Yet here, human cadets were tossing live grenades into trenches as if it were a casual exercise. "Why take such risks?" Kel asked, his voice strained. "Surely there are safer methods." Harlow gave him a sidelong glance, his expression turning unexpectedly serious. "There's nothing safe about war, Commander. The sooner they learn that, the better. It's not about avoiding danger, it's about mastering it." The words hung heavily in the air, leaving Kel to ponder the sheer audacity of the human approach. To the Cossack, war was a matter of strategy, technology, and maintaining a safe distance from chaos. For the humans, war seemed to be something that thrived in the chaos, something they sought to master through sheer grit and first-hand experience. As they walked through the academy grounds, pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. The swift victory over the Kidari, the unprecedented tactical precision, the seemingly impossible coordination between space and ground forces, it all stemmed from this foundation of relentless training and controlled chaos. The humans hadn't just prepared for war, they had immersed themselves in its very essence, embracing its unpredictability and horror until it became second nature. They didn't train their soldiers to avoid hardship, they trained them to welcome it, to find clarity in confusion, and strength in adversity. Kel realized with growing unease that the galaxy had gravely underestimated humanity. They weren't just another species with advanced technology and tactical doctrine. They were warriors forged in the crucible of their own making, each soldier a testament to their species' unwavering determination to master the art of warfare in all its forms. As the tour drew to a close, Kel found himself standing at the Academy's observation deck, watching the cadets continue their drills despite the worsening weather. The scene that had initially appeared as madness now revealed itself as something far more profound, a glimpse into the core of human military might. "Tell me, Major," Kel said, finally voicing the question that had been gnawing at him throughout the tour, "is this how all your warriors are trained?" Harlow's expression softened slightly. This is just the beginning, Commander. What you're seeing here, it's the foundation. The real training comes later. Kel felt a chill run down his spine. If this brutal, relentless conditioning was merely the foundation, what heights of martial prowess did humanity's elite warriors achieve? The implications were staggering. The galaxy had witnessed humanity's efficiency in ending the Kidari War, but now Kel understood the true scope of their capabilities. They hadn't just won a war, they had demonstrated a fraction of what they could do. And that realization was perhaps the most terrifying lesson of all. The New Order. 1 month after the Kidari surrender, the Coalition High Council chamber buzzed with nervous energy. Representatives from every major species had gathered to discuss the new galactic reality, one that had been irrevocably altered by humanity's brief but devastating demonstration of power. General Corvo stood at the speaking platform, his normally confident demeanor tempered by the weight of what he had witnessed. The assembled delegates fell silent as he began his address, each knowing that his first-hand account of humanity's intervention would shape their understanding of the future. Distinguished representatives, he began, his voice carrying across the vast chamber, we gather today not just to celebrate peace, but to understand its architects. In 5 hours, humanity accomplished what we could not achieve in years. But the implications of their victory extend far beyond the end of hostilities. The holographic displays activated, showing detailed analyses of human military operations during those fateful hours. The precision strikes, the coordinated assaults, the seemingly impossible tactical maneuvers, all documented in excruciating detail. What you're seeing is not just military superiority, Corvo continued. It's a fundamental reimagining of warfare itself. The humans didn't just defeat the Kidari, they rendered our entire understanding of combat obsolete. Admiral Merrick stepped forward, his scaled features set in a grim expression. We've all read the reports, but numbers and tactical analyses don't tell the whole story. The humans didn't just win, they controlled every aspect of the conflict from the moment they entered it. They knew exactly how the Kidari would react, precisely where they would retreat, and specifically how they would break. The chamber erupted in murmurs. A Vextai representative, their crystalline form shimmering with agitation, raised their voice above the din, but surely this level of preparation is impossible. No species could anticipate every variable in a galactic conflict. Impossible for us, perhaps, Merrick replied. But we've learned that human military doctrine is built on foundations we never considered. While we focused on perfecting our existing strategies, they were preparing for every conceivable scenario, and many we thought inconceivable. The holographic display shifted to footage from the Human Military Academy that Commander Kel had visited. The assembled delegates watched in a mixture of horror and fascination as human cadets endured their brutal training regimens. This, Corvo gestured to the images, is where their victory truly began. Not in the battle itself, but in preparation that started generations before they ever encountered us. The humans don't train soldiers, they forge them through adversity, honing not just their bodies and minds, but their very understanding of conflict. A Giraffe elder, their ethereal form pulsing with concern, spoke next. But what does this mean for the balance of power? Humanity claims they seek peace, yet they possess capabilities that could dominate the galaxy. Corvo's expression darkened. That's precisely what we're here to discuss. The humans have rewritten the rules of engagement. Their victory wasn't just military, it was psychological. They've demonstrated that they can end any conflict decisively, efficiently, and with minimal casualties, on their side. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. The humans hadn't just won a war, they had established a new paradigm of power. Their capability to end conflicts swiftly and decisively meant that the very nature of interstellar politics had changed overnight. But there's more, Merrick added, his voice grave. Our analysis suggests that what we witnessed was only a fraction of human military capability. They showed us exactly what they wanted us to see, no more, no less. The holographic display switched to showing the current disposition of human forces throughout the galaxy. Their fleet movements were precise, methodical, and seemingly random, yet patterns emerged suggesting a level of strategic positioning that made several delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. "They're not occupying conquered territory or establishing military outposts," Corvo explained. "Instead, they're creating what they call response zones, areas from which they can react to any threat within hours. They're not preparing for the last war, they're preparing for the next one." A Tellarian diplomat rose, their multiple arms moving in patterns of distress. "Are we to understand that humanity now effectively controls the galaxy's security?" "Control isn't their objective," Corvo replied. "They've established something far more subtle, and far more effective. They've created a situation where warfare itself has become impractical. Any species considering military action must now factor in the possibility of human intervention, and we've all seen how that ends." The display shifted again, showing the reconstruction efforts in former Kidari space. Human ships worked alongside coalition vessels, helping to rebuild what the war had destroyed. But beneath the appearance of cooperation, everyone in the chamber understood the implicit message: peace would be maintained, one way or another. "The humans have a saying," Merrick added, "si vis pacem, para bellum, if you want peace, prepare for war." We now understand this isn't just a philosophy to them, it's the foundation of their existence. They've prepared for war so thoroughly that they've made it obsolete. A younger delegate from the Ixian collective spoke up, their voice trembling slightly. "But what do they want? What are their true intentions?" Corvo's response was measured. "Based on all evidence, they want exactly what they've achieved, a galaxy where large-scale conflict is deterred not through treaties or alliances, but through the absolute certainty of swift, decisive intervention. They've created peace through the perfection of warfare." The chamber erupted in discussion, various delegates arguing about the implications and possible responses to this new reality. But as Corvo watched the debate unfold, he knew that they were missing the larger point. Humanity hadn't just changed the rules of warfare, they'd changed the very nature of power in the galaxy. The holographic display showed a final image, a human cadet standing in the rain during their training, face set with determination despite the harsh conditions. "This," Corvo said, his voice cutting through the chaos, "is what we failed to understand. While we saw humans as newcomers to galactic politics, they were preparing for this moment throughout their entire history. Every conflict, every hardship, every challenge they faced on their homeworld was preparation for securing peace on a galactic scale. And they succeeded," Merrick added softly. "Not through overwhelming force or superior numbers, but through the perfect application of carefully honed capabilities. They didn't just win a war, they made warfare itself obsolete." As the council session drew to a close, the representatives filed out in contemplative silence. The galaxy had entered a new era, one where the threat of conflict was tempered by the certainty of human intervention. It was, perhaps, not the peace anyone had envisioned, but it was peace nonetheless. Corvo remained in the chamber long after the others had left, watching the holographic display cycle through images of human military precision. He thought back to that moment when the first human ships had appeared on his tactical display, and how quickly everything had changed. The humans hadn't just ended a war, they had fundamentally altered the course of galactic history. And as Corvo finally turned to leave the chamber, he couldn't help but wonder if this had been their plan all along. Not just to win a war, but to ensure it was the last one anyone would dare to start. The galaxy had witnessed the power of humanity's preparation, the efficiency of their execution, and the totality of their victory. But perhaps most importantly, they had learned that in humanity's eyes, the perfect battle was the one that never needed to be fought. Peace through strength was an old concept, but humanity had elevated it to an art form. They had achieved what countless species had dreamed of for millennia, they had made peace inevitable not through diplomacy or deterrence, but through the perfect mastery of warfare itself. The new galactic order was established not with a bang, but with the quiet certainty that conflict itself had become obsolete. And perhaps that was humanity's greatest victory of all.